Thanks. Hopefully you can see my slides. Um, I'm going to be talking about MRM highlights. It's a initiative of the journal Magnetic Resonance in Medicine, which is part of the umbrella of the ICE-MRM community. I'd say there's three pillars of MRM highlights. We do regular interviews with some authors that have published in the journals about the work. At each ISMRM, we have an annual magazine that we publish, including those interviews and some additional interviews specifically for that conference. And during non-pandemic years, we typically throw an ISMRM after party that's fairly popular. It was initially created by Nicola and Erica, and Atef Baji also contributed during those years. And for the first 5 years, what they would do is interview the two editors' picks from the editor-in-chief's selections for each issue. And together they created 5 magazines over those years. In 2020, Matt Bernstein, who was the editor-in-chief of MRM prior, decided to pass the baton to Peter Jezzard, and Nicola and Eric, I thought it was a good time to also pass the baton. So I took over the digital content with the help of Atef that first year, and we split it into two categories. So I took care of the digital content from that point on, and initially Mark Chu took care of the magazine, and then after the first 2 years, Maria is now currently in charge of the MRM Highlights magazine. So currently, what we do is we interview people that have published papers that exhibited, I'd say, like exemplary research, reproducible research practices. We typically publish for each of those papers 2 blog posts. So one is a Q&A about the authors and their paper and their work. And the second one is a questionnaire that we ask them about their reproducible research practices. And then at the end of the year, like I said previously, there's an annual magazine that collects all those interviews, and there's some additional special features and interviews for the issues. I think together we've also to editorial talking about reproducibility and open source. And so at the end of Matt Bernstein's tenure and Nicola's tenure, they published an editorial about reproducibility and the future of MRI research. And that sort of set the stage for the direction that I wanted to go when I took over. And 3 years into my tenure, we published I guess like a review of the current landscape of open source research in MRM and the ICE-MRM community. Just to give you an idea, I started collecting stats. I would look at every paper and evaluate, what they shared, how they shared it, and that type of stuff. And so, I'd say from 2019 to 2021, there was a fairly big shift. There was a tripling of papers that shared code or data. So about 2021, it was about 1 in 3, and since then, I'd say it's somewhat stabilized. I haven't looked at this year's values yet. And there's also been somewhat of a shift in terms of the language when they share code. So MATLAB, I don't know if it's becoming less popular, but I think there's an increase in Python specifically. So either there's a decrease in usage in MATLAB, or people that have decided to now share code were using Python. And Julia is fairly low. That Julia is somewhat of a MATLAB alternative, but people that do Julia are very passionate about it. So they do really fun stuff. There have been some recent changes at MRM. One of them is the data availability statement that was added, I think, in 2020. And so this is available outside of if the paper is not open access, you can still access this with the abstract. And so whatever is shared here, anybody can check that out. And that's also included in the paper. And then this year, we had a recent MRM change where the ICE-MRM Reproducible Research Study Group decided to offer a code review. And so when you're submitting to MRM, you'll get this option to select if you want somebody from the study group to review your code. And the code is reviewed just for technical purposes, not the scientific content. So I thought I'd give you just an overview of what we did last year, because that year was completed. And so our first interview last year was with Antonio and Santiago, and they had published a new technique on diffusion MRI, and they integrated it into their open source toolbox here. We also did a few times last year some roundtables, and so MRM Highlights has a YouTube channel where we published these, and this was in collaboration with the Reproducible Research Study Group. And so we had interviewed Adrian Campbell, Washburn, and Michael Hansen about the MRI data format. I'd say a lot of publications that share code also do deep learning, and so this is somewhat of a challenge in terms of like, what do you share? Do you share the training data? Do you share just the trained models? And so it's always interesting speaking to these authors. And so we interviewed Jenpan and Kenny, and they had shared some code that reproduced their figures using their trained networks. Speaking of people that were passionate about Julia, we interviewed Jacob Aslander and Daniel Sodikson, and about a paper on magnetization transfer, a new method that they had developed. And Jacob had created a really, really nice interactive website, or I'd say somewhat like a Jupyter book, if you're aware of those, with interactive figures, reproducible code. And this is a really good place to check out if you're new to magnetization transfer. We had interviewed Cal Gilbert and Corey Barron as well about an RF coil design that they had done. So occasionally we'll see people that share hardware-related content, and it's fairly rare, but it's nice to see when they share. So these people had shared their coil design in the CAD file format and some image reconstruction code. And I know there's some challenges in terms of sharing those details sometimes, but it's an important thing to look out for. We had interviewed Joseph Woods and Divya Bolar about an ASL method that they developed, and they had used Zenodo, which is a place that you can host code and data, and that'll give you a DOI so that you can cite that in papers and other places, which is a good tool to use if you've not tried it. We had another roundtable, this time with Cassandra Golden Prague about open science. That's on our YouTube channel too. We interviewed Yael and Martina, and they had integrated their method into a larger toolbox, so HMRI, and provided scripts that reproduced all of their simulation figures. Their last roundtable was with the organizers of the ISMRM challenge, and so we had a good discussion about reproducibility and that challenge as well. And so here we interviewed Aga, who's been a contributor to MRM Highlights, and Nicola Stigov, one of the founders, and they published a paper on vendor-neutral sequences, and they had shared, open source pulse sequences, Docker containers, BIDS compliant data. So BIDS is somewhat of a file format for standardizing imaging data, and a good interactive and reproducible Jupyter book. And our last interview was with Leila and Ariane, and they had shared some sample data, code, and demo scripts. So in addition to that, the Highlights magazine had some special features. And so last year, Roberta this year, left the ISMRM. So we had an interview with her. There's typically a presidential interview, and then some special features. So we had interviewed the youngest ISMRM presenter ever, and some of the initiatives such as democratizing MRI, so MRI in Africa and Southern Hemisphere. We had interviewed the organizers of ISMRM during the SARS pandemic in Toronto, and the challenges that they had encountered that were similar to COVID, and all of the Young Investigator Award finalists as well. All of our magazine are archived on the ISMRAM blog, and so you can go here and download any of the PDFs from the prior years. So I thought I would, having said all that, I know some people might still be hesitant about sharing code with their paper or data with their paper. I know a lot of the concerns that people have. Sometimes they say, well, I'm not a software engineer. I'm really an amateur coder, or like don't know or haven't documented things well and aren't using special, techniques like unit tests, or even have scripts that reproduce all the data analysis. And really, it's not necessary. It's nice to have these things if you want to work towards that. But I think sharing something is better than sharing nothing. Just having some code that does your analyses or your algorithm really supplements well what you write in the paper. I personally always feel that reading the equations is more challenging than reading code, and seeing somebody's code really clarifies often what they did in the paper. Some of the recurring questions that we asked the authors that we highlighted, I think are good questions for you to ask yourself as well, if you're thinking about that, or if you're doing that. And so, like, the first one would be like, why do you want to share your code or your data? There might be different purposes of sharing your code or data. If it's just for reproducibility, you can write scripts that will reproduce all your figures. If it's for clarifying what's in the paper, then maybe just sharing the algorithms is sufficient. And some people really want to share for reuse, and so they'll create the big toolboxes. There's really not one perfect way to do it, I think. Check your lab or institutional policy on code and data sharing. Institutes are increasingly adding these types of policies, so it's important to see what they can offer and what they're asking of you. What stage you decide to share your code or data, it will somewhat dictate what's reasonable for you to share and how you can share it. If you decide earlier on, then it's really easier to create reproducible figures. But if you just decide during the review process, maybe just sharing what you have is good enough, and you don't really need to spend a lot of time improving it. How can we encourage researchers? How can we encourage you to contribute more open source code? There's always new reproducible research habits, tools and things like this. You don't need to use everything, but it's good to keep an eye out on what's new and what people are using in the field. And so we had, I think it was like 31 or 32 interviews so far since 2020. And Aga Karakuzu, which I mentioned that we had interviewed, who's in my lab, decided to train a custom chat GPT on them. So he called it NeuroRepro Insights. So all the interviews, he created a text file and trained this GPT on. And I thought I would ask it, to summarize some of the answers that the authors had given. And so why did people choose to share code and data? The majority, have a personal commitment to transparency and open science. They're really passionate about it. A lot of them did it for collaborative advancement. Sharing code, really opens the door to collaborating with other groups or people using your work. Some of them is just lab culture. You get into a lab that's doing open science, you'll just keep doing it. And a lot of them wanted to maximize the impact of their work. And so having your code and data out there will make it a lot easier for people to use it and then to cite you. In terms of lab or institutional policies, it really varied on that point. Some labs share everything with all their publications. Others don't have a policy. They'll do it if the student is willing. And some institutions have new policies that, expecting open science practices and data sharing. And so that's why I mentioned it's important to check that. What stage that people decided to share the code of data. Most people, I'd say, decided really early in the research process, but a few would just have that urge or that realization during the peer review process. And so even after the paper was accepted, would add a little note saying where their code was. Offering incentives could encourage researchers. A lot of people say it would be really nice if funders and grants and institutes would, value this and value the time that's needed to do this. More recognition is important, like in terms of, applying for tenure. Like this is, they count papers, but they don't count the work that you might have done sharing your code. Having good institutional support is important, and having advocates amongst your peers about doing open science is also important. And in terms of like reproducible research practices to look for that people are thinking about using or want to use. So interactive notebooks, Jupyter notebooks is a popular one. There's often new data hosting platforms that people want to try out. Like I mentioned earlier, Zenodo, there's OSF, there's a lot of them. Docker containers to containerize and really, I'd say, archive your, not just your code, but everything that's needed to run your code. So that's a good tool that people are using and are looking to use more. And then there's some services that provide code reviews or DOIs for your code and data. So Zenodo and NeuroLibre, those types of places. So you can find us a lot of places. Our main blog posts are on the ISMRM website, MR Pulse. We're on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, X, and LinkedIn as well. We have a YouTube channel, so all of our video interviews that we have saved over the years and roundtables are there. And there's a author-reader dialogue forum that we have on the ISMRM website as well. And for my last slide, I thought I'd just show some of our recent contributors for some of the interviews. So thank you very much.